My name is Kristen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Programs here at Pajarito Environmental Education Center, also known as PEAK in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I will be moderator for tonight's talk. PEAK is, of course, the nonprofit organization that operates the Los Alamos Nature Center. Visit our website, peaknature.org, to learn more about visiting the Nature Center and more about our upcoming events. I want to take a moment to acknowledge our wonderful members and donors for your generous support. For details about other PEAK programs and how to become a member and/or donor, please visit our website, peaknature.org, or if you're in the Nature Center tonight, stop by the front desk before you leave. So just a few logistics before we get started. This is a hybrid talk. So our presenter, Jonathan, will be taking questions via Zoom chat and from our in-person audience. For those of you watching from home, you will find the chat feature in the Zoom app menu bar. Type your questions to the PEAK moderator or Jonathan directly if you would like in the chat window, and we will answer those questions at the Q&A section at the end of this presentation. Please remember that not everyone is in the room here with us. Or sorry, repeating that. Please remember that not everyone in the room here with us has a microphone. So there may be a delay while we listen to questions and then try our very best to relay them to our virtual audience. After this talk, you will receive a short evaluation in your email. Please take a moment to fill that evaluation out. Your input helps us improve future programs. Okay, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jonathan Hayden, and he's going to get started and tell you a little bit about himself, and I will monitor the chat for your questions. Thank you so much. Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you to the Pajarito Environmental Education Center for providing such a lovely venue. For those of you who are joining online, we're doing this from Peaks Planetarium. It's been a long time since I've been in a planetarium, probably since I was in grad school at the University of Colorado Boulder, went to a laser light show at the Fisk Planetarium on campus there, set to Pink Floyd's The Wall. So I can't promise as visually stimulating presentation this time around, although I do have some footage of some Lesser Prairie Chickens performing their mating dances. So we'll see how that compares. Again, I'm Jonathan Hayden. I'm the executive director of the New Mexico Land Conservancy. I've been doing work in the conservation space here in New Mexico for the last decade. First with the Santa Fe National Forest, doing land use planning work, then doing policy advocacy, and now here at the helm of the New Mexico Land Conservancy. Here's one of those prairie chickens as a little preview for what we're going to talk about tonight. Just a little overview of what I'm going to be going through here. If I have a thesis tonight, it's really that conservation is no longer just about protecting places. It's really about connecting them. That's becoming ever more evident in a rapidly fragmenting world, especially when you see all the development that's going on here in the Western United States. So I'll start by talking a little bit about what that fragmentation entails, what it means for wildlife, and then how the conservation community is stepping up to protect some of New Mexico's most cherished landscapes. I'll talk a little bit about habitat connectivity in very broad strokes, what it is, a very wide-ranging field, pun totally intended there. I'll talk a little bit about some of the species-specific protections that we've undertaken recently, which is kind of on one end of the spectrum. And then the other, talk a little bit about connecting these kind of landscape scale, conservation protected landscapes. And then I'll close out by just talking a little bit about wildlife and the wildland-urban interface. The WUI is a term you all may have heard of in the past. It is particularly relevant here in Los Alamos and other population centers like Santa Fe, Albuquerque, elsewhere that are kind of at the transition between the built environment and the natural world. So when we talk about, fragmentation and conservation, I think it helps to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about what the problem is here. And really, fragmentation of natural landscapes goes back to Western conceptions of private property rights. So I kind of like to start a lot of these discussions with just showing a map of land ownership in New Mexico. Here you can kind of see just how diverse, fragmented, and a patchwork that land ownership actually is. You can see, for example, we do have big natural areas in the forms of um, national forests, like the Gila in the southwest part of the state, the Santa Fe and Carson in the north, the Lincoln in the south central, and the Cibola kind of in the central and west. You have a lot of tribal lands in orange. Bureau of Land Management managed lands are a lighter shade of orange. And then everything in white, kind of that interstitial space, is private land. About 50% of New Mexico is private land. And in many ways, private land is at most risk of development, right? There are not the same sorts of protections that you have on federal public lands, on state parks, on wildlife management areas, et cetera. Private lands, this is a private properties influenced country we live in, obviously, are a lot more susceptible to development, and the public has a lot less say over what happens on private lands. Population is projected to increase up to 35% here in New Mexico over the next 25 years. I think a lot of you have probably seen, that what the housing crisis looks around the state, and also the boom in construction in a lot of places, especially down by Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and to a lesser extent here in Los Alamos. This growth is resulting in a huge conversion of over 50,000 acres of undeveloped land each year, and the loss of associated ecosystems, water rights, etc. So really, here in New Mexico, we're undergoing kind of a sea change in how our land is used. And I know I've talked a lot about housing development, but this also includes industrial use, extractive use, oil, gas, renewables, and all the associated transmission lines, infrastructure that accompany them. So what does that fragmentation look like on the ground? So a pretty extreme example here on the right is kind of this subdivision built in the middle of a forest, right? It's kind of really incompatible with the surrounding land use. When you look at that, what do you see? You see a lot of houses, obviously. You see a road. Each road, of course, into a subdivision has an impact in and of itself. It can divide wildlife habitat. It can cause issues with erosion, for example, even filtering down into our water systems, increasing turbidity. Each one of those homes probably has an associated septic system, power lines. As many of you know, especially here in Los Alamos, power lines are a huge cause of wildfires as well. Um, and this is something that's happening all across the state right now too. Oh, just lost our screen here. Okay. So when we talk about fragmentation, we're also talking land use that's just incompatible with the surrounding character of the natural landscape, right? And like I said, it's not just housing, it's also extractive use. These photos are from the San Juan Basin in northwest New Mexico. It's not as productive a basin as it once was, and the Permian has certainly taken over the mantle in terms of the most productive oil and gas region in the state. But you can see across the landscape these scars from development, whether they be old pump jacks like this on the left, or on the right, you can just see just how much associated roads, well pads, and infrastructure has really kind of divided and fragmented a lot of our land. So then what is conservation, and what are we doing to kind of combat this transition from natural landscapes to um, development that just does not complement our ecosystems? Here in New Mexico, we're blessed to have a very long history of conservation champions. People like to go back to Aldo Leopold, one of the fathers of conservation in the U.S., and point out all the great work he did here in New Mexico. 2024, for example, was the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Gila Wilderness, the first federally designated wilderness in the country. But of course, New Mexico's history and its history of conservation and living with the land goes back much further. Um, Obviously, a lot of our tribal communities were pioneering a lot of the same conservation and land restoration practices we still use today. And then our Sacred communities, land grant communities, et cetera, came afterwards and really established an ethic of living in harmony with the land. And that's one thing I really enjoy about Aldo Leopold too, is he kind of took all those ideas, iterated on them, and really wanted to ensure that the human perspective and human use of land is not lost as well. I think it's unrealistic to think that we can just kind of cloister wilderness away from human impacts, especially in a day and age when our impacts are so pervasive and so well felt across the natural world. So I think it's really important that we remain cognizant of our use and impacts when we're pursuing conservation protections. In New Mexico, we kind of have a term for this called natural heritage. And again, that's really about living in harmony with the land, ensuring that ecological systems can survive and thrive alongside of our communities. So there are a lot of different approaches to conservation, and these are two examples on the screen that are kind of different ends of a spectrum on how to best enact conservation protections. On the left is one project I worked on when I was with the Santa Fe National Forest to acquire the Valley of the Spirit Ranch that surrounds the village of Jemez Springs. If you all have been to Jemez Springs before, it's got those beautiful kind of volcanic tough spires just below the mesas when you look up from the town. That was all actually private land owned by one landowner, and it kind of served as a buffer for the local residents of Jemez Springs to actually access the Santa Fe National Forest. So we were able to leverage some federal funding from what's called the Land and Water Conservation Fund and just purchase that land and have it incorporated into the Santa Fe National Forest. And by doing so, also ensure that it's never going to be subdivided, developed into condos, vacation homes, et cetera, and all the, associated impacts that has with roads, septic systems, power lines. And then kind of at the other end of the spectrum is basically local oversight of land use planning that most commonly takes the form of zoning regulations. So, this area can be used for housing, this one for industrial use, et cetera, et cetera. But that certainly has its limits. It does not prohibit development outright. Oftentimes, there are very contentious public processes involved. Um, and at the end of the day, a lot of times new developers can develop what they want. So, middle ground. What we do at the New Mexico Land Conservancy is primarily something called conservation easements. These are basically legal agreements with landowners to never subdivide or develop their land, but they get to continue to use it as they have. So it's a great kind of middle ground that leverages our private property rights system, but also results in a great conservation outcome. We know that going forward, not just this landowner, but landowners in the future in perpetuity will not be able to subdivide their land or develop it, but they can still continue to use it as they have, which often takes the form of agricultural use, farming, ranching, or just conservation minded, recreation or enjoyment of that land. Here at New Mexico Land Conservancy, our tagline, our motto is kind of simple. We help people conserve the land they love. And again, that is usually through conservation easements on private land that they own and helping people who want to protect that proactively to ensure that, 10, 20, 100 years down the line, they will know that their land is still intact and still supporting the same ecosystems it did when they put these protections in place. We are New Mexico's only statewide land trust, so we work in all four corners of the state and even in southeastern Arizona. This map that's on the screen shows with the little dots all the projects we've done in our 24-year history. The ones with stars are the ones we just completed in 2024, I believe. We do have a goal of protecting 1 million acres by 2030. We're getting pretty close. We just hit the 800,000 acre mark about a week and a half ago. So 4/5 of the way there. We're not the only land trust in New Mexico, though. Um, Land trusts are nonprofits that typically hold conservation easements, establish conservation protections for land across the state. So, in addition to us at the New Mexico Land Conservancy, we have a few more local organizations, the Taos Land Trust and Santa Fe Conservation Trust, both operate in their respective localities. The Rio Grande Agricultural Land Trust operates almost exclusively in the Middle Rio Grande Valley and has a particular emphasis on helping kind of generational farmers protect their land and their water rights. And then the Nature Conservancy, which is kind of the big national player in this space, does projects in New Mexico as well. So pivoting a little bit to habitat connectivity. So when you say habitat connectivity, nowadays, people often think of what's on the screen here, this, beautiful, highly engineered crossing of an interstate or some other barrier to migration of elk or bears or antelope, etc. Um, it is a lot more than that. It does include, really just making sure that landscapes are available to wildlife so they can move and that ecological processes can endure. So again, what these kind of large wildlife crossing infrastructure projects have been very much in the news recently. Here in New Mexico, we had a wildlife crossings bill that passed the legislature about 3 years ago and then received a lot more funding just, I think, 2 years ago and last year. New Mexico Department of Transportation is currently planning to build a large crossing on 550 just west of Cuba, New Mexico, I believe, primarily for use as an elk crossing. So this is something that's getting a lot of attention, and for good reason. You have the combined effect of help facilitating not just wildlife crossings, but also minimizing conflicts with vehicles. And so there's a huge safety component there to be had as well. These crossings and infrastructure projects have even made their way into pretty urban areas. This photo here of a mountain lion was taken just on the outskirts of Los Angeles, California, somewhere where there's obviously been a lot of suburbanization over the last really 50 years. Um, and as that development is encroached on natural landscapes, these kind of conflicts or interactions between humans and animals like mountain lions are only becoming increasingly common. So folks in LA have really done a good job of establishing some of these crossings for those wildlife to really live in harmony with the rapidly suburbanizing community. Here in New Mexico, we have a lot of issues around border crossings down in on the Mexican border. It's been particularly in the news recently, and even going back about a decade to when you all may have heard of Hefe the jaguar, who was frequently crossing back between Mexico and New Mexico down by Antelope Wells. It's one of the last remaining jaguars that we had seen in the Chihuahuan Desert. And then more recently, Ash of the Wolf. Has anyone here heard of Ash of the Wolf, the yep, Mexican gray wolf? This is obviously an endangered species. It's been quite controversial, reintroduction of wolves across the state, but Asha has kind of become the mascot of that effort and has been, I believe, captured and re-released a number of times now, but is still out there thriving. She does, yeah, exactly. Yeah, she was crossing I-40 there. So a lot of, the discourse around habitat connectivity really focuses on those what we call charismatic megafauna, the wolves, the jaguars, the mountain lions, etc. But again, it really goes so far beyond that, and it also includes aquatic systems too, right? Here in New Mexico, that's particularly important because we have so little water, and those aquatic species are so reliant on sometimes just, a handful of miles of stream or river, and being able to fully connect those can be, the difference between life or death for, an entire species in a given area. So here's a picture of a Rio Grande cutthroat trout. This is our state fish, I believe. It is also a listed endangered threatened species. Um, it used to range pretty widely throughout New Mexico and southern Colorado, but as we saw, even some of our streams and rivers be more fragmented and cut off from each other, their numbers really dwindled. Thankfully, there has been a renewed effort by a lot of grassroots organizations like Trout Unlimited and Amigos Bravos out of Taos to really restore and connect a lot of those streams so that they can once again be home to populations of this special trout. It even includes aerial corridors too. The Rio Grande Flyway is one of the big migration corridors for migrating bird species in the western U.S. So I mentioned the Rio Grande Agricultural Land Conservancy. They do a lot of work in the Middle Rio Grande Basin in conjunction with like Bosque del Apache and other wildlife management areas to ensure that cranes and snow geese and other species of migrating bird, especially fowl, waterfowl, have places to stop. That's especially pertinent in places like Los Lunas and the south parts of Albuquerque, Bernalillo County, Valencia County, where you see the rapid proliferation of data centers and other big industrial parks. Um, in addition to using a lot of energy and taking up a fair amount of space, a lot of data centers use a tremendous amount of water for their cooling systems. And unfortunately, a lot of that water comes out of the Rio Grande and is, our water rights. They're bought up from farmers and other folks who, um, would otherwise put that water back onto the land. When we say habitat connectivity, we don't necessarily mean it has to be, spread out over miles and miles of land. Connectivity itself can also be pretty localized. Um, I put a prairie dog up here, which can actually travel up to 5 or 6 miles to migrate to new homes and to find new forage. But even within a given landscape, they do a fair amount of moving around and making sure that, even just one relatively small parcel enables some of these species to move around, especially like prairie dogs, which are what we call a keystone species because of their kind of integral effect on a given ecosystem as both prey, but as an animal that also really helps cultivate grasses and other forbs, um, works in symbiosis with pollinator species, and even provides homes in the way of abandoned burrows to creatures like burrowing owls or even badgers. And I mentioned our big million acre goal, but I do want to stress too that it's not just about the quantity of acres, it's really about the quality of habitat that is on those acres. Um, During a time of really historic drought and climate change, we are seeing a lot of changes to just the kind of vegetative makeup of our land, a lot of our landscapes. This is a picture of some juniper encroachment into what is traditionally sagebrush or grassland habitat. So I just want to underscore that your conservation um, also has to work hand in hand with restoration of land to ensure the best habitat possible. So, like I mentioned, I'll be offering a couple case studies here. The first is really focused on saving a particular species, the lesser prairie chicken. It is so much more impressive than its name would suggest. There is also a greater prairie chicken, but I think there's got to be something better out there. I mean, it's colorful, it's got a lot of character, and so I wanted to play just a quick clip for you all of the prairie chicken mid-mating dance here. Obviously, they're pretty feisty birds, very colorful. This footage was taken down near Milnesan, New Mexico, which is, or was at least, the site of the annual Prairie Chicken Festival each year, where birders congregated from across the country really to kind of get a glimpse of a bird that's only been increasingly rare in this part of the country over the past 20 or 30 years. Unfortunately, this bird has largely been at the center of a legal battle that's been going on now for over 15 years. It's been listed as a threatened endangered species numerous times before being delisted and litigated, et cetera. Most recently, it was again delisted back in 2025. I believe that was in sometime in August. Yep. But we recognize that there's more to it than just a federal listing status. And so thankfully, a lot of organizations have banded together to do what they can to save this species, um, which is really in decline, especially in New Mexico. It does have a range that extends up to Oklahoma, Colorado, and Kansas. But the southern population that you see here in southwest, or excuse me, southeast New Mexico and Texas is the one that's really struggling right now. Just given the location, can anyone try to guess why? Exactly. Someone said Permian Basin in the audience. Um, so unfortunately, the lesser prairie chicken can be considered something of a panda of the Permian because it has some very um, finicky needs when it comes to the habitat it occupies. So it requires large chunks of unbroken grasslands to really thrive, typically around 20,000 acres or more. It also has a pretty extreme aversion to tall vertical structures. It can, you know, perceive those as being trees or other perches from which predatory birds can hunt them. And when that happens, it won't do its little dance for potential partners. So here's kind of an illustration of what a lot of the Permian can look like. And you can see just, given how tall its structure is, how denuded the landscape is around the well pad, et cetera. why that would be a huge issue for a bird that requires those large, unfragmented landscapes. We've even seen an encroachment of mesquite trees down the Permian Basin too, that has also contributed to the lesser prairie chickens decline. Mesquite trees can grow large enough that they also kind of provide that perch habitat for predatory birds. Thankfully, like I said, a number of organizations, including our state land office, recognize that this bird's protection is going to require us to do a little bit more now without a federal listing. So we have been working with them as well as a renewable energy company, NextEra Energy, and a mitigation bank that does restoration work to ensure that we can conserve as much habitat down there in the Permian Basin for this bird as possible. So we just completed a 4,300 acre protection project near Portales. And then we've also paired that with a conservation lease on almost 20,000 acres of state trust lands administered by the state land office to ensure that there can be restoration work done on that land and that there will not be any development that would endanger the species any further. That the restoration organization, Riverbank, the mitigation bank, they actually do active removal of some of those tall vertical structures as well, whether they're old oil and gas infrastructure, could be even just telephone lines, electrical lines, etc. And they do a fair amount of mesquite removal as well. And this is kind of a aerial map view of where those protected landscapes are. And we always try to build a protected landscape that's contiguous and as large as possible, just because of the nature of land ownership. This one's a little L-shaped and a bit of a patchwork itself. But taken all together, this is more than 20, I think this is almost 30,000 acres of protected land that we have completed or is currently in progress right now. And you can see kind of the bottom left an example of what those roads and well paths look like from satellite view and see just how that fragments the wildlife habitat of the prairie chicken. So going from a specific species to a much broader idea of conserving an ecoregion, I just wanted to talk a little briefly about our work to conserve the White Sands ecoregion, named after White Sands National Park and Missile Range. White Sands Missile Range is actually the largest military installation in the United States that has pluses and minuses. It does mean that the vast majority of it is never going to be developed. So you do see a lot of really interesting species down there that don't thrive many other places in New Mexico. There's a healthy population of desert bighorn down there, for example, Bolson's tortoise, along with some species that were introduced in the 1960s, like oryx and ibex even. It's a wild time for New Mexico Department of Game and Fish back in the 60s when they were bringing in African species. But it our work here is really focused on connecting some of the existing federally conserved lands, include places like White Sands National Park, and even the Lincoln National Forest, with places like Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge, Sevieta National Wildlife Refuge, and then Grand Quivira National Monument as well. So there's two big orange chunks on this map I'm going to talk a little bit more about, both of which were projects that we have recently completed. First one is Armendaris Ranch, which is owned by Ted Turner. This is actually the second largest conservation easement in the country at over 315,000 acres. It stretches all the way from the Rio Grande in the west. Well, the Rio Grande basically composes the western boundary of Armendaris Ranch, It goes all the way from Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge down to Elephant Butte Lake, and then over the Fra Cristobal Mountains towards the San Andres Mountains and White Sands Missile Range. And Ted Turner's folks have done a lot of great restoration, habitat protection, and species reintroduction down there. You can see the bison here. They've also reintroduced desert bighorn to the Fra Cristobal Range, and done a lot of work to make the Bolson's tortoise thrive down there as well. So Armendariz is the one here on the left, and you can kind of see just how massive it is. If you've been to Elephant Butte Reservoir, it's pretty big end to end, and that really just makes up a quarter of the western boundary of Armendariz. The second project I want to talk a little bit about is to the north of White Sands Missile Range, area called Chupadera Mesa. So this is actually our second largest project ever after Armendariz Ranch. And includes a great contiguous area called Chupadera Mesa, obviously, just south of Mountain Air that has been really untouched in a lot of ways, really since it was depopulated by the Jornada Mogollon people about 400 years ago. A lot of those cultural resources and archaeological sites remain out there. So, I mentioned, we're always trying to think about kind of the human element, human impacts on some of our conservation work. And that can often take the form of protecting cultural resources as well as just habitat for wildlife. So in this case, Seco Pueblo, 195 room Pueblo ruin is located on this particular site, and that is protected through this project in collaboration with the State Land Office as well. And the second landscape I wanted to touch on is a much more recent project for us, and one that I would guess almost everyone in the room and on the call is familiar with, Ghost Ranch. Most of you, I think, associate Ghost Ranch with Georgia O'Keeffe, her paintings of those kind of iconic vistas of Cerro Pedernal. And that is largely where we got the most media coverage. The Santa Fe Reporter, for example. I think this is the Santa Fe, New Mexican on the left recently, Albuquerque Journal on the right, and then even the Associated Press and New York Times covered this, kind of all through the lens of protecting the vistas that inspired Georgia O'Keeffe. And that is, a great narrative, a great story, and a great element to this project. But like I said, it is so much more than that. Ghost Ranch is over 20,000 acres. It actually extends all the way down to the Rio Chama, which is shown here, and includes about 4 miles of Rio Chama frontage and about 8 miles of Abiquiu Lake frontage. And all of that provides great habitat to a lot of aquatic and riparian species that you don't really see many other places in New Mexico. So here's just a few other photos from some recent visits out to Ghost Ranch. And you can see again just how undisturbed this landscape is. Thankfully, the owners of Ghost Ranch have been excellent stewards of this land. They do their best to undertake restoration projects whenever they can. They do graze the land during the winter. It's actually a cooperative of Abiquiu area ranchers who all graze using very kind of minimally invasive methods. So it's all unmotorized. They're out there on horseback doing their cowboying. And that has really, really good implications for the ecology of the land. So here you can see Ghost Ranch in kind of the broader context of conserved lands in northern New Mexico. You can see it's almost immediately adjacent to the Chama River Canyon Wilderness. and the Rio Chama Wild and Scenic River. And then once completed, will in fact connect those protected spaces to Abiquiu Lake, and then the other side of Abiquiu Lake, the Carson National Forest and Santa Fe National Forest. So it's a really great opportunity to again connect not just the land, but also the water in a way that's going to support a multitude of species. Here's just a couple examples of some of the animals that have been sighted on Ghost Ranch. So the top left, we have the Pinyon Jay, which is kind of one of the iconic birds of northern New Mexico, also known for being in decline, largely because of our decline in pinyon pines across the state. And then beavers are getting a lot of love these days too for their role as natural engineers of our landscapes here in northern New Mexico. But the one I'm most excited about maybe are river otters, which have been sighted there on the Chama, which are exceedingly rare here in New Mexico. So having the opportunity to protect habitat for them is pretty special. Here's just kind of a close-up view of Ghost Ranch and the areas where we're trying to protect. We're biting this one off in chunks, and this will be a multi-phase project. Well, by the time we're done with it. Just another map with a few photos of some of the vistas and attributes of Ghost Ranch that make it so special. And like I mentioned, it also extends all the way down to Abiquiu Lake, includes quite a bit of shoreline. We do have a website set up for this project, in particular, just ghostranchconservation.org. So lastly, I want to talk just a little bit about wildlife in the wildland-urban interface. I think folks have probably heard that term used before. Again, it is really kind of what we think of as a transition from the built environment to natural spaces. And it is an area where the most conflicts between humans and animals typically takes place. And are areas where I think we need to be the most cognizant of what our impacts on the land are to ensure that species can continue to traverse some of those areas and thrive in those landscapes. So the example I have on screen here is actually my office in Santa Fe, the Pachesky Conservation Center. We're located down by the community college. On the right there, forming the eastern boundary of our land is Richards Avenue. You can just see I-25 there, in the very northern part of the map too. It is an area that's been rapidly suburbanizing. Even since this map was made and this aerial photo was taken, there's been almost complete build out of the subdivision to the east and south of our land. And we really have a woman named Jane Pachesky to thank for having such a great resource. Ms. Pachesky was a prominent female conservationist in the Santa Fe area. She and her husband Gene helped start the Santa Fe Rodeo, and she had the foresight to place some conservation protections on her quarter horse ranch well before that area rapidly started suburbanizing. And then she decided to leave the ranch to our organization as a gift. We understand that we would use that as a kind of a hub for conservation education and stewardship. So just a little bit more about the wildland urban interface. I won't go through all this data, but New Mexico has some of the most undeveloped WUI area in the country, although that is rapidly changing, especially in places like Santa Fe and Albuquerque, where you have subdivisions that are built right up to the wilderness boundary. So we're trying to view our work at the Pachesky Conservation Center as enabling a sanctuary for local wildlife. We recently received a grant, actually, a number of grants from New Mexico Outdoor Recreation Division, Land Trust Alliance, Wildlands Network, Carol Petrie Foundation. We're also working with the Institute of Applied Ecology to undertake a restoration plan for our property that will identify ways that we can make that a little more habitat friendly, especially as the surrounding land is subdivided and developed. So here's just kind of a drone view of some of our land. It's very much pinyon juniper woodlands with a lot of pretty verdant grassland habitat as well. It's actually something you don't see a ton of in northern New Mexico anymore. Most of it's been grazed quite a bit. This land has not been grazed since the mid 60s, so it's had a long time to rest and recover. So let's see here. The first phase of our study out here is really identifying the species that are on the property already and what their needs are. So conducting a wildlife survey via camera traps, even some high-tech microphones that pick up bird song and even bat chatter, and then performing a vegetation inventory to see what kind of plants are out there, forbs, cacti, grasses, etc. And critically, what we don't have, so that we can, moving forward, try to replant what was historically there that will hopefully attract a lot of the wildlife that is also historically there. And then looking ahead, we'll undertake some of those restoration recommendations. Um, and then, given that we are a land trust that has worked with over 140 landowners, we really view it as our role to kind of communicate a lot of those best practices in terms of restoration to our broader network of conservationists. So here you can see them putting up some of those fancy microphones. And here's a little bit of the footage that we picked up. So we kind of knew we'd see some of these species, right? Like I showed the jackrabbit earlier. Prairie dogs are fairly common, as are, coyotes. Those roam around quite a bit in the outskirts of Santa Fe. But then there were two that really kind of surprised me. Uh, One were all the bobcats. We actually picked up footage of, we think, three different bobcats that have been crossing our property. And for context, this is only about 260 acres, so it's fairly large for, a suburban parcel of land, but not huge by any means. And I had actually seen a bobcat just hanging out next to my office one day last summer and thought it was just a totally freak occurrence. But um, these cameras have shown that they're actually pretty regular visitors. But the one I was maybe most astounded to see were, again, this is multiple instances of this. There were badgers on our land. So yeah, especially as someone who grew up in Wisconsin and went to the University of Wisconsin, seeing my college mascot on our land it was pretty tickling. hmm we do think, well, we know actually that badgers, prairie dogs, and coyotes all kind of work together. Um, I don't know if you could call the prairie dogs aren't, yeah, they're doing a lot of work and not getting much back in return. But the badgers will often hunt the prairie dogs um, in conjunction with coyotes. The badgers will basically dig into the prairie dog burrows, and the coyotes will go wait in the burrow exit for the prairie dogs to pop up. And then once the prairie dogs move location, the badgers will often move in, take over their homes. So really excited, first of all, that we have all this wildlife located on our property, and then also to hear what kind of recommendations we can be doing to be better stewards of that land and facilitate more habitat production and connectivity. You know, a lot of the concerns in suburban areas are different than, say minimizing the impacts of well pads and that type of thing. But a lot of the focus is on making sure that we have the right kind of plants on the property to provide forage for keystone species like prairie dogs. But it also means removing fencing that can be a huge barrier, particularly old barbed wire fence that can really impede connectivity. We're also providing some recreation opportunities at the Buchesky Center. So we're rehabilitating our 1 mile trail. The idea there is to make it more of an interpretive trail that is educational in nature and talks a little bit about the history of the landscape of the outskirts of Santa Fe, the various flora and fauna that can be found there. Um, we have some great vistas of the Sandia Mountains, as well as the Sangres and the Jemez. So next time you're in Santa Fe down by the community college, I encourage you to come check us out. Here's just kind of a map of our trail right off of Richards there, where we've got some interpretive signage that we're putting up. We also, not too long ago, just wrapped up our own speaker series. Our fall one was a pretty interesting mix of topics. We had one on New Mexico's bats back in October, which is International Bat Month, as you might be able to guess. It's also the month of Halloween. We had one on alpine flora of New Mexico, so focusing on the different flowers, wildflowers that you can find up in alpine environments. And then we had a winter outlook with a gentleman from Open Snow, who's a local meteorologist. We'll plan on doing a speaker series later this spring and then probably one more in the fall. And those will kind of more focus on how you can be a conservationist in your local community, in your backyard, that type of thing. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. I do have two links up here on the slide, nmlandconservancy.org and ghostranchconservation.org if you want to learn more about us or what we're doing over there just across Abiquiu Lake.
Perfect. Thank you. We do have a couple questions. So the first one online is, does the New Mexico Land Conservancy have any projects focusing on connections between pollinator habitats or connecting migratory pathways for species like monarch butterflies?
That is a great question. We are, as part of our work at the Buchesky Center, we're actually working with the Xerxes Society too. They have what are called pollinator kits that they will often give out to landowners. They're often kind of a mix of native flower and grass seeds that provide pollinator, habitat for bees and birds, etc. We also recently completed a project with the landowner up along Ute Creek in the northeast part of the state. Her name is Tutta Cruz. She actually won the Aldo Leopold Conservation Award 2 or 3 years ago for her work to establish a migratory bird sanctuary on her land. It's an area where there's been, frankly, a lot of overgrazing and encroachment of cholla cactus. So she's done a lot of cholla removal and planting of native grasses to make that more visible for avian species as a place they can stop by on their way south or north.
Perfect. Thank you. We also do a pollinator kit up here in Los Alamos, and we were inspired by Caitlin and Xerxes in Santa Fe. Um, okay, I have a couple questions. If people in the room don't have questions, first question. Um, you mentioned you have an acreage goal by 2030. Do you have prioritized areas that you're focusing your efforts on? And are any of those areas on the south side of Santa Fe?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like I said, it is a mix of quality and quantity when we talk about acreage, right? We typically do try to focus on areas that connect with existing conserved landscapes. Certainly, that was the case with a lot of the White Sands ecoregion projects we've done, and even with Ghost Ranch having connectivity there to the Rio Chama Wild and Scenic River Corridor and National Forests, et cetera. And then, on the south side of Santa Fe, obviously our work at our office, the Pachesky Center, has been a huge focus of ours. Um, and we've been staying abreast of a lot of the developments down there as well. And are always open to working with developers to do more to place open space. Uh, I wouldn't say restrictions necessarily, but set aside land for open space when they are developing, or work with landowners who want to just prohibit development entirely. We are working with an organization right now just south of Santa Fe, between Santa Fe and Cerrillos, really, called Synergia Ranch. It's actually an organization that built the original biosphere over in Arizona. They also have a ranch south of Santa Fe where they do a lot of sustainable agriculture. And so we're working with them to protect their land in perpetuity.
Awesome. That's great. I do have, so I know other states, this is a follow-up to something you just said. I know other states have, um, I guess, rules, guidelines put in place for development where there's a certain percentage that has to be put aside for non-developed space or like parks or whatever natural spaces. Is that the case in New Mexico or no?
It really depends on the local jurisdiction. So land use planning is primarily a function of local government, whether that be a city or county. So it really just depends on what the perspectives of your city council or planning commission or county commissioners are. Um, and so it often ends up being kind of more ad hoc. Um, as much as I'd love to be there to be eco-region wide land use plans to protect these really valuable landscapes. In practice, that's just generally not how it happens. So that really leads to us being just very opportunistic in our selection of projects, and of course, focusing on those that have the most connectivity benefit, but also being realistic.
Last question I have is you mentioned that there's a spread of mesquite in prairie chicken habitat. What is causing that spread?
That's a good question. The short answer is I don't know off the top of my head, but I think there's probably a few different causes. Yeah, I was talking to the the wildlife biologist who leads that restoration work down there, and he said, climate probably definitely has something to do with it. Also, just all the transportation that goes on down there. Trucks, vehicles don't just transport people, they can transport seeds as well, right? And that's, something we see across the West, to be honest. Yeah, I mentioned the Cholla encroachment in the northeast part of the state too, and that's, largely a product of just having a more mobile human population.
Okay, last question for me. Is your space, the Petoskey area, is it open to the public and when?
Great question. It is open to the public Monday through Friday, typically from around 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Um, so we encourage you to come on by. There's a little parking lot, there's a little trailhead there. Um, we will be undertaking those improvements and doing some trail restoration later this spring. So we might close it down for a little bit while we do that. And right now it's a little muddy, but I would think it would dry out in the next week or two. And if you have any concerns, feel free to just give us a call ahead of time, and we'll let you know the trail status.
Awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your organization with us and everything that you're doing. I think it's amazing, personally. So yeah, that's the end of our talk. Thank you so much. Round of applause, both online and in person for Jonathan. Um, And then, of course, you can contact them using the information on the screen. And with that, thank you, everyone. Have a great night. And I hope you join us again for our next program.
Thanks, everyone.